Hi, everybody, and good afternoon. My name is Radhika Sao, and welcome to part 2 of Genetic Contributions to the Developmental Journey. This is going to be a conversation with the NIMAC genetics team and the Virginia Genetic Navigators. So my name is Radhika Sao, and I'm joined here today by my wonderful colleagues, Alyssa Terry, and the two of us are from the New York Mid-Atlantic Regional Genetics Network. It's a big mouthful, so we call it NIMAC for short, and I'll give you a little more information about that in just a few moments. And we're also joined by the lovely Dana Yarborough and Lisa Richard of the Virginia Center for Family Involvement. And we're really grateful for this opportunity to be with you all today. So, for those of you who joined us in September, in our part 1, we discussed a bit about genetics, a bit of genetics 101 review, we called it. We talked about why genetics matters for early intervention professionals like yourself. And we also discussed some red flags or some concerns parents may have that might indicate that their child might have a genetic issue. In part 2, today, we're going to go into a little more detail about what NIMAC is, who we are, and what we're doing here in the great state of Virginia. We're going to delve into what the Virginia Genetic Navigator program is and what they do for families. And finally, we're going to talk about how NIMAC and the Virginia Genetic Navigator program can be a resource for EI professionals like yourself. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background information about who NIMAC is. So as I said, NIMAC stands for the New York Mid-Atlantic Caribbean Regional Genetics Network. And we're one of 7 regional genetic networks that are supported by a federal grant funding from the Health Resources and Service Administration, HRSA for short, Maternal Child Health Bureau. And our goal is to ensure that underserved individuals with genetic conditions and their families have access to quality genetic services. And as you can see here on our map, our region includes 10 diverse jurisdictions and over 62 million people from Delaware, the District of Columbia, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Puerto Rico, West Virginia, and the US Virgin Islands. So we do really account for a very large and diverse group of people. So you might be asking, how does NIMAC do this? So on the next slide, we do this by collaborating with local stakeholders to promote increased access to genetic services. Because our region is so large and diverse, we understand how important it is to listen and work with local people who are living in the different parts of our region. And that's why we collaborate with various stakeholders from all of our jurisdictions to ensure that individuals with heritable conditions and their families have access to quality care and appropriate genetic expertise. We have a leadership team made up of people from the New York State Department of Health, Johns Hopkins, the University of Pittsburgh, FARA Genetics, RTI International, and more. And we also have a regional advisory committee that includes approximately 15 stakeholders from across our region that provide regular feedback and input. So again, how does NIMAC achieve its goal? Well, we work to support such efforts as improving the genetics delivery system, again, by collaborating with diverse and motivated individuals, professionals, and organizations from throughout our region. We fund telemedicine projects to make genetics appointments easier for families. And finally, we educate families and healthcare professionals about genetics. For instance, has anyone ever participated in a NIMAC event before, such as our annual conference? If so, please either raise your hand or you can use the chat to say so. Our annual conference occurs every April and it's virtual. So I know we've had a few of you join us in the past, and hopefully after today, we'll get it on your calendar for this coming April. In addition, we also have a really great website that has a lot of resources. Has anyone ever visited our website? Again, please feel free to use the chat to share if you have. And if not, we hope that you will after today. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our NIMAC teams. because these came about because we wanted to ensure that we were being mindful of the varying needs within the NIMAC region. And in order to do so, we wanted to work with local stakeholders to make sure the voices of the people living in each state, district, and territory are being heard. And thus the NIMAC teams were created. So across all of our jurisdictions, we strive to form a team of local and diverse collaborators. We try to make these groups represent a lot of different perspectives that help us to understand how the genetic system is working in that state, district, or territory. So our teams include individuals themselves who have genetic conditions and their families, advocates, genetics and non-genetics healthcare professionals, and public health representatives. Specifically, I focus particularly on our continental teams, and their timeline is such that in their first year, they focus on defining what are the key challenges to accessing genetic services in their area, with a focus on those underserved populations, barriers involving distance, or even education. And then the team will brainstorm possible solutions and craft a project plan. In the second year, they implement the chosen project to see how they can improve access. And then in later years, they look for further opportunities to monitor how the project is doing and see if there's other ways to tweak it and again, improve access to genetics. So in Virginia, we truly had a collaborative effort. And we really wanted to make sure that the Virginia team had diverse representation from throughout the state. And therefore, we, as you can see here, we invited genetic providers, families, other healthcare providers, training groups, groups from maternal child health, newborn screening, Title V, industry insurance, and others to join us. There are a lot of amazing groups on this, listed on this page today. And I'm curious, if any of you have ever worked on it, please raise your hand or say so in the chat. Many of these groups have been really instrumental in helping us improve access in Virginia, and I won't be surprised if many of you are intimately familiar with them. So, as I said, when our Virginia team first met, we were trying to figure out why families may be struggling to access genetic services in the state. And we quickly realized that families and even providers may not know where they should be going for genetic services. So let's just do a quick, not a test, let's just see where everybody's at. So if you could, use your stamper and show us where you think the genetic services are located throughout the state. Seth, I'll pass it on to you. All right, I see we're starting to slow down. So let's see where they actually are. So you guys are right. If you could see from the overlap here, and Seth, we can leave this on for just a few seconds. You're absolutely right. Not surprisingly, the clinics are located generally where the big cities are, and there's only a few in the region and other regions of the state. As you can see in the western part of the state, there is one, and in the southern part, there is one too, but there's really not a lot in many parts of the states. You could see these like deserts of genetics clinics, which we realize is, of course, going to be a massive barrier for families who are trying to access genetics who happen to live in those regions. So, as you can understand and appreciate, distance does end up becoming a fairly significant barrier for families. And if you move on to this next slide, as we met together as a team, we started to discuss what else might be preventing families from accessing genetic services. And I would love it if you could use the chat to give me some of your perspectives as why you think families might not be able to access the genetic services they need. Yes, I see insurance. Insurance definitely can be a barrier for some, depending. Expense, yep, expenses, because even if insurance does cover it, there can be additional costs involved, you know, co-pays, co-insurance, and the like. Transportation, wow, yes, transportation is definitely a significant one. Travel. Myths, oh my God, Beth, yes, myths. People have a lot of misunderstanding about genetics. That's a great one. Thank you. I see Andrea has a whole bunch. Cost, distance, childcare, work limitations. Yes, yes, and yes, absolutely. those are all cultural bias. Kelly, another great one. Yes, there are people who have very strong cultural concerns when it comes to genetics and, are worried about that. Joanne, yes, length of time to get to an appointment. As you can imagine, considering there's only a smattering of genetics clinics, there are going to be significant wait times. I see here again, transportation, lengthy appointments, and yes, support from the pediatrician. Yes, not all pediatricians are making those referrals when we want them to. So that can also be a significant barrier. Stephanie, oh my gosh, yes, fear of what they will find. Yes, there are a lot of concerns. Some parents don't want to, they're worried they're going to open Pandora's box and worried that, what am I doing? Do I really want this information? And so there is an actual fear that's very true. Families just say, maybe I'd rather not know. And it's valid. It's valid to know that, but hopefully, today you'll hear from us why it can also be incredibly empowering as well. And as we talked about time off for parents, people are working. These are all really significant barriers. So, and these are things that we've seen not just in Virginia, but throughout the NIMAC region. So I wanted to just take you on a really brief tour of some of the other projects we've done across our NIMAC region, to just share with you some of the ways that we have tried to overcome some of these barriers. So you'll see on the next slide, on the left, you see a whole bunch of different types of what we call infographic flyers. And these were used to help deal with some of these concerns you had, particularly with the support from the pediatrician. We wanted to help educate pediatricians and families about why genetics would be important. So many of our teams, including in New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, wanted to help improve the education about genetics, not only, as I said, for providers, but for families as well, to help combat, as some of you mentioned, the myths involved and the cultural concerns. So they and these many of these flyers that you see here, these infographics, have been translated into numerous other languages such as Spanish, Creole, Mandarin, Korean, Hebrew. So we're trying to make sure we reach people where they're at and in a language they're comfortable with to, again, help them to understand that. Again, when it comes to building, the myths and worried about cultural bias and even trust, if you look on the top, in our DC team, we have videos actually to help build trust in genetics because of cultural concerns that were made by families within DC itself to help, other families feel more confident when they are referred to genetics about going and to discuss what, the benefits of why genetics can be helpful for that family. And along the bottom, there are two other things we did. In West Virginia, on the extreme right, they had an issue. They just don't have a lot of genetic professionals in the state. At one point, they were down to one genetic counselor, no geneticist at all. So we were trying to fund genetics education for providers so that they can help support families until that infrastructure was built up, which I'm happy to say is being done. And in the middle, you see this green, kind of looks like a chalkboard. It's supposed to represent a webinar, and that's what we're doing in New Jersey. We're actually working with community health workers in New Jersey. We're going to be training them to, again, help break down some of those cultural concerns and work with families to help them understand why genetics can be valuable to them and help them to understand why the expenses and the travel and the transportation might be an important thing to overcome, and ways that they can help support families and provide them with resources. So these are just some of the things we've done in different states to help support families. And in Virginia, particularly, the focus ended up being a little different. So Alyssa, if you can go on to the next screen. In Virginia, we realized our focus was going to be on educating and supporting families who do require genetics. As some of you realize, there is a long wait time to get genetics. So what the Virginia team thought would be helpful would be to support those families during that wait time by creating what we call a genetic navigator training add-on for volunteers who are already part of the Center for Family Involvement. And I'm going to now pass it out on to Dana, who's going to share with you more about that. Dana?
Thank you, Radhika. So I'm sure the 65 or so of you that are with us today probably have burning questions about, who are Virginia Genetic Navigators? Where do they work? What do they do? So Lisa Richard and I are going to spend the next 15 minutes kind of sharing a little bit more information to hopefully answer those questions for you. But first, I want to share just a little bit about the Center for Family Involvement where we work. So I'm Dana Yarbrough, the director of the Center for Family Involvement, and we were formed about 20 years ago at the Partnership for People with Disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University to bring evidence-based family support practices to Virginia. We call ourselves the CFI as just an acronym, so you might hear us say CFI. The CFI is currently funded by one federal agency and 4 Virginia state agencies to act as a family engagement arm, if you will, to ensure that families of newborns, including people up into their 40s who have developmental disabilities or delays or special healthcare needs, have access to unbiased information, emotional support, culturally responsive information, and help understanding and navigating all of the relevant early care and education, health, kindergarten to 12 school systems, and the adult service systems. So I want to run a quick poll, if we can have Seth put one up. Just curious about how many of you are even aware of the Center for Family Involvement. So if you can check all of the statements that apply on the poll that popped up on your screen. We'll give it just a few more seconds. So it looks like we're about even, with about half of those that responded have heard of us, and the other half have not heard of us. We don't have anyone so far reporting that they have themselves called in a professional capacity or as a family member, or have referred at least one parent or family to the Center for Family Involvement. So we're going to hope that if we ran this poll in a week from now or a month from now, we would see a big difference in these results. So I'm really glad that at least today there's some more awareness of one of the resources for family support in Virginia. So we can stop that poll. So great, we're going to go to the next slide. So just a little bit more about where we are. The Center for Family Involvement, as you can see, has some depth and spread across the Commonwealth. We have 6 regional family-to-family coordinators. Lisa Richard is one of our regional coordinators. A handful of disability and rural and elderhood specialists. We have several culture brokers, and we have a network of over 70 volunteers who assist families in meeting a variety of needs. There are some red stars that are on the screen, which show, again, some of our areas. And our genetic navigators are really spread out amongst these, where you see these red and orange and green stars. You're going to learn more about exactly where they are in just a few moments. Our next slide. Just again, why I think it made sense for the Virginia NIMAC team to consider this genetic navigator model, and why it felt that it worked really well within the Center for Family Involvement, and why we were chosen to pilot this in Virginia, was because we are already using an evidence-based form of family support called parent-to-parent. It's parent-to-parent is an intentional matching of a parent. So we train parents, grandparents, siblings, step-parents, adoptive parents, to become peer mentors for other families who call for support or are referred by a professional to our office. And they are intentionally matched because there's some similarity in their family makeup, their culture, the child's diagnosis, the current need. It could be hospital surgeries, it could be the current need. And so we do that kind of careful matching of the parents and family to one of our staff or volunteers who have a similar experience or background for that one-to-one. And so the genetic navigators made a lot of sense. And when we looked amongst our staff and volunteers, we were quickly able to identify a first group, our base of 10 parents and grandparents who could be trained, who already had that foundational family support skills. Next slide. And because you probably want to know what training they received, here's just a quick snapshot. This training was originally there was the Mountain States Regional Genetics Network, which is one of the partner genetic centers with NIMAC, had developed a genetic navigator model, a little bit different than Virginia's, but somewhat along the same concept of using families to support other families. And so we were able to partner with the Mountain States Genetics Center to help us really think about what the training could look like. So these are about 6 to 7 hours of training that the genetic navigators went through. They already had about 8 to 10 hours of family, parent-to-parent family navigator training. So we've really given them a lot of skills and equipped them a lot of tools. So you'll see we talked about the introduction to genetics and red flags. Some of these were in part 1 of this series. So there was some similar content that the genetic navigators received. We talked a little bit about the importance of how families can have conversations with primary care, some of the resources that are existing for families, genetic specific resources, and some of the tools. We spent some time thinking about cultural sensitivity when it comes to genetics and how people view disabilities and genetics. And then we ended our training with some really important information about how parents who are supporting other parents can take care of themselves, because you give a lot of yourself emotionally, and how do we take care of ourselves and set some boundaries. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Richard, who's going to go a little bit more in depth about what genetic navigators do.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate it. I am Lisa Richard. I'm with the Center for Family Involvement, and I am a regional network coordinator, and I work in Southwest Virginia. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what do genetic navigators do, since I am a genetic navigator. And so does anybody want to put in the chat or just throw some ideas out about what they feel a genetic navigator does? Any thoughts on that? And while you all are thinking about it, I'll tell you simply what we do, and then I'll tell you more specifically what we do. So simply, we assist families of children or adults with disabilities of special health care needs more easily access or navigate genetic services. Yes, give peer-to-peer support, all of those things that you're putting in the chat. We help guide families, point of contact, help people navigate. Absolutely. Thank you for participating. And so more specifically, what we do is we help identify accessible genetic clinics, geneticists, and genetic counselors. We share tools to help families plan for appointments. We provide emotional support to families. We provide reliable, unbiased resources about genetics and genetic services. We identify educational opportunities for families to increase their general awareness of genetic conditions and genetic services. And we help families prioritize and reprioritize next steps. We also share skills and resources with families to help them advocate for themselves and their family. And so, I mean, we really are prepared to simplify the genetics journey by providing one-on-one support to families. And just to clarify, we're not, as genetic navigators, we're never a replacement for an appointment with a genetic counselor or a geneticist. And so this next slide is my why slide. And this is why I really wanted to get involved in this program. I already support families at the Center for Family Involvement, and I try really hard to meet them where they're at. And when we discussed this Genetic Navigator program, I just felt it was going to be really important, because I remember when I first started. So I have a large family, as you can see. These are my 7 children. My oldest daughter is Zoe, and she was diagnosed with Down syndrome at birth. And I just kind of have to start out by saying how grateful I am to those that are in early intervention in that profession, because I was a new mom, and I was young, and she was the first grandchild on both sides. And we were really, really scared as a family. And we just didn't know what to do. And early intervention came in and really supported us. And I'm forever grateful to all of you and what you do. And we really just received great and wonderful advice and how to proceed as a family. I mean, it just benefited us so much. And we went ahead and we had two other daughters. And then about 5 years after Zoe was born, we just had this incredible opportunity to adopt Camden. And we had moved to Virginia at that point. And so then we were able to benefit from Virginia's early intervention. And I'll be honest, one of the things that really empowered us as a family and really helped us to make the decision to adopt Camden is we knew we would have access to early intervention. It was just such an important benefit to us when Zoe was born. And hello to Natalie if you're here, but she was our early intervention specialist here in Virginia. And Camden and Berkeley are only 5 months apart. And I always say I must have looked like I was having fun, because then I had a set of twins, and then I had my daughter, Sarah. So this is a little bit about my why. And when Zoe, you see her in this picture with her brother Camden, they were going to a prom, not necessarily together, but there was a whole inclusive group that was going, and this is a picture of them prior to leaving. But when Zoe was in high school, she was diagnosed with selective mutism. And as a family, we were just really concerned and didn't know what was happening. And we had the benefit of meeting with a geneticist. And that's when I realized that genetics was beneficial across the lifespan, that it wasn't just something that was a diagnosis, but that you could meet with a genetics counselor or a geneticist and learn more about a genetic condition. And meeting with this geneticist, it was just a real comfort to know that we were doing everything that we could for her based on the recommendations from this very kind of wonderful geneticist. And so this is my why. Next slide, please. And so some of the families that I work with, many of them that I support in Southwest Virginia, we've talked about barriers. And if you're familiar with Southwest at all, some of those significant barriers are lengthy wait times for genetics appointments. And of course, you have transportation challenges. And I've met with families who were unaware that their child's diagnosis, like myself, who could present differently across the lifespan. And I recently was supporting a family, and their child was presenting with behaviors that they had never seen before. And I told them a little bit about my experience with Zoe and how that geneticist had helped us, because she was, in the end, diagnosed with regression in Down syndrome. And so this person then decided that they would also reach out to a genetics counselor and try and make that appointment through their pediatrician. And even though they had a long distance to travel, just learning about my experience helped them to decide that they wanted to be more knowledgeable about what may appear in the future of their child. And I also just told them how much it benefited our family as well. And so my training as a genetic navigator really assists me to have more in-depth conversations about why it is important, not just medically, but educationally, to really understand the genetic condition. And I'll just tell you, families always, I mean, I hear this every time I talk to a family, and I support many families, is how much they appreciate getting this information from someone that has been on a genetics journey and has lived experience. It makes all the difference. And then I'm able to really talk to them about genetics and why they may or may not want to meet with a counselor or a geneticist. Next slide. And so who else could benefit from a genetic navigator? Well, I mean, there are many families that are struggling with undiagnosed conditions, who have concerns like we did about regression or any of the other red flags that we discussed, concerns about seeing possibly similar behaviors in a sibling, other families who will voice a concern to a pediatrician, but then the pediatrician wants to take a wait and see attitude, and how we can better support those families in presenting why they'd like to have an appointment with a geneticist or a genetics counselor. And it really, as genetics counselors, we're just trained to also provide that emotional support to families that have either just been diagnosed or facing a possible diagnosis. Next slide, please. And so this is perspective from genetics counselors. We had a genetic counselor student. She built her leadership project around evaluating the Virginia Genetics Navigator program. And she spoke to both genetic navigators and to genetic counselors. And what the genetic counselors reported seeing was that they saw the real benefit in having this network of genetic navigators, particularly like myself, if they were located in a culturally or geographically underserved community. And they thought that genetic navigators could support parents in knowing how to advocate for referrals to genetics, or if there was any hesitancy on the part of the pediatrician, they could also possibly do presentations in communities about the importance of genetic services. So we got really positive feedback. Next slide.
I found this on the web.
It's my watch. And so we really appreciated this quote from one of the genetics counselors, and how they said that, a mom talking to another mom or dad, or talking to another dad, can make those connections and build a rapport that professionals don't have, and really share that life, that same lived experience. And they said that the quote was like, professionals don't have the same lived experiences as a family, so having a family who has been there and who has walked in their shoes is invaluable. And I have seen that over and over again when I'm providing support to families. Next slide. So the burning question: how do you contact a genetics navigator? So at the Center for Family Involvement, we have a helpline and a phone number for families to contact us. And a family can reach out in whichever way is comfortable for them. And someone will get back to them usually within 48 hours. And if the family shares that they have a genetic concern, or they're interested in speaking with a genetic navigator, they'll be matched to one of our 10 genetic navigators across Virginia. All right, thank you. And I'm now going to pass it to Alyssa.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Hearing Lisa's story, I always feel is the most valuable part of our time together. So extra thanks to her for sharing her beautiful family with us. So as we talk through all these things, and we're 38 minutes in now, we're thinking that some people may still be asking kind of, what does all of this have to do with early intervention? And how we see it is really that we think early intervention professionals are excellent at detecting signs and symptoms in the children that you work with and noticing those subtle clues, and also really great at helping families get connected to other services that could benefit them. And these skills are really perfect for linking families to genetics. So because of your training and understanding of milestones and those concerns or red flags, any EI professional is really well positioned to help a family get connected to genetic services by supporting the family and advocating for a genetics referral. EI professionals can also connect families to the genetic navigator, and so we'll start to see these other connections happening, to provide support and information as they decide if they want a genetics appointment, and or as they wait for an appointment or navigate the system. So ultimately, you see this web of connections build between primary care and linking them to genetics, and then ultimately the family getting linked to genetics with the help of their primary care. So we see what a pivotal role the EI professional can play there in the center. So this is a slide that we discussed in part 1 of our time together, and I just wanted to use it as a reminder today that in Virginia, in order to promote that medical home model of care, we do encourage that families share their concerns with their primary care or pediatrician to have a conversation about exploring possible genetic causes of their symptoms. So anytime you're working with a family, we're really encouraging you and encouraging the genetic navigators to tell the families to take those concerns back to primary care or pediatrician to have that conversation about next steps. So what we want to think about is how, among the many other things you have to do every day, can we make genetics something that's on your radar, to be looking out for those potentially concerning symptoms that we talked about together in part one, just into the everyday work with your kids. So I'm just curious if you guys can share whether genetics is something you think about when you're sitting and working with families, or if not, do you think it's practical and reasonable as that it could be something that you're thinking about regularly? So if we could use the chat just to. Okay, yeah, Tara's asking tips to get the pediatrician to listen to families. That's exactly what we're going to talk about next, is sort of things that we can do to support families as they go in to have those conversations and to advocate for further exploration. Great, it's good to see that people are thinking about it regularly. Perfect. Great, that's really good to know. So hopefully we're just here, giving you further tools to put in your very full toolkit that you already have to help those families. So that's really great to hear that you're also asking about family history, because we're going to talk about an example of how that family history becomes important in just a few slides. All right, so some of the sort of tips we wanted to share is just how can you empower families when they're preparing to go and have that conversation with primary care, because people have mentioned already in the chat that sometimes they're not getting the response that they want from their pediatrician or primary care about being concerned about next steps. So we really think it's valuable to remind parents that they are the expert on their family, as they might feel a little bit nervous going into those appointments. And that even though the provider has a lot of scientific and medical knowledge, it's really the family that has the personal history and day-to-day experience. So they're bringing that wealth of knowledge to the table. And we can really, EI professionals and genetic navigators can really have an important role in teaching the family key tools to advocate for themselves and for what they think their child needs. So we have some tips to share for families about having those conversations with primary care. One thing that we think is helpful just to help people get organized is to encourage them to prioritize their top 3 concerns. So sometimes the parents will have a really long list, or maybe the EI professional even has a really long list of things they've noticed that make them a little worried. But we often find that bringing just the top 3 to that first conversation can sort of streamline the conversation. We also think it's helpful for families to write things down about what they're seeing. So if they're seeing a certain behavior or symptom or something that's new to them, to write down how often it's happening, write down what time of day it's happening, what environment it's happening in, just so they really have kind of data to bring to the doctor to share what's happening. We think it's valuable to encourage families to bring someone with them to the appointment. It can be really hard to remember what conversation takes place when you go in nervous with a lot to say. So bringing someone else is a great tip. And encouraging families to schedule a follow-up appointment if they don't feel like they had enough time to get to all their concerns. So, let them know ahead of time. If you go to this appointment and you walk out feeling like you didn't get to everything, go right away and schedule another appointment so that you can get through everything. And lastly, to let families know that they have every right to be speaking in their native language, even if they typically go to medical appointments and speak English for the benefit of the provider. If this is a really complex or sensitive or stressful conversation they have to have, that may mean that it's a lot more comfortable for them to speak in their native language. So, always to encourage families to ask for an interpreter if they need it for that appointment, to really help explain their concerns to their best of their ability. And then just some basic conversation starters. So things we can tell families they can say to start talking with their doctor. So they might just start with, I'm concerned about X. And remember, we encourage them to bring at most 3 things. Maybe they can say, my concern of whatever it was, regression, loss of a skill from our last visit was not resolved, or maybe it worsened. What can we do to explore this further? And then someone mentioned in the chat the family history. So maybe they would say, in talking with my family, I learned that we have a history of seizures. Is it possible that this is genetic? So these are all good things just to think about as things a family can do. And there is a handout that you will all get at the end of this session that summarizes those last 3 slides to help you prepare families to go have those conversations. So we hope that that's a really useful tool, because we know it can also be stressful for the early intervention providers to know kind of what to say to families when they start to feel like something might be going on. Okay, so we're going to go through just a quick case example of what it might look like if there was an early intervention professional who helped connect families. So many of you are probably familiar with the Learn the Signs Act early resources, and you'll see that up in the right-hand corner. And this is just an example of a little boy who at his age 2 checkup, the pediatrician felt like he was having some delays and linked him to early intervention, and he started receiving speech therapy. But after working together for a while, a couple months, the therapist starts to notice some other concerning behaviors and symptoms that really aren't part of the speech therapy issue that she's addressing. And in addition to that, she's also noticing that the boy's younger brother also has some significant delays. So for those of you that were with us in the first session, we talked about something called the rules of 2. And this was, again, on another handout that we provided. And this is one example of the rules of 2. So there's 2 members of the family that have symptoms that seem to kind of be related, and there's no real clear explanation of this. So what are your thoughts about next steps that the therapist could take at this point when she's starting to feel that there's something might be going on? What are your thoughts in the chat, what they could do next? See that, Seth? Put that handout in the chat so we can get it from there, and it'll also be available afterward. Good. Ask mom if she's noticing things too. Maybe she's seeing the same things or even more things than the EI professional. Right. Asking if there's a family history, other people than besides the 2 boys that have similar symptoms. Great. Perfect. Those are great thoughts. So in this story, the therapist is concerned there could be something going on with the boys. So she documents her concerns in her own notes and then encourages the family to speak to the pediatrician about both boys, and supports the family with some tips about how to prepare to start that conversation, as we just talked about. And the therapist also connects the family at that time to a genetic navigator. So then the family talks with the genetic navigator. They review the story together, and the navigator helps the mom write down her 3 top concerns that she's observed with the boys and the ones the therapist noticed. And then genetic navigator talks to the mom about asking the pediatrician if there could be a genetic link, and provides the mom some more resources for her appointment. So after the family goes back and talks with their pediatrician, they go and have that conversation, and then the primary care provider does indeed link the family to genetics. And throughout the process, the genetic navigator remains connected to the family and supports them through their appointment and testing process and beyond. And the therapist continues as well with her therapy with the family. So you can see, again, we sort of rebuilt that web of support around the family. In this particular case, testing revealed that the boys had Fragile X syndrome. And this is caused by a change in a single gene. Everyone has an FMR1 gene on their X chromosome, but when that gene changes, it can cause certain intellectual disabilities, behavioral and learning challenges, and various physical characteristics. Although there's no cure, the genetic diagnosis can really help families know what to expect in the future, guide best therapies, interventions, and medications to treat symptoms, and to plan for health risks to other children, and also medical issues that could arise with other family members. And importantly, also connect with other families for support and other clinical trials. So this is just one example of how early intervention professionals can play a really important role as a detector. They saw those concerning symptoms in the boy and his brother, and then made connections back to the primary care provider, to the genetic navigator, and then primary care was able to connect them to genetics. So the red flags handout we provided you in the last session can help you know which kids might benefit from a genetics appointment, but you can also find more resources on the NIMAC website, or just encourage the family to ask those questions of their primary care. Is this kid a good candidate to go for a genetics visit? Again, for more information about the Virginia Genetic Navigator program, you can visit the NIMAC Team Virginia page, and all of the information is there. You'll get handouts today as well about the Genetic Navigator program, so you know how to contact us. And with that, we are happy to open it up to any questions.
Thanks. Alyssa, you did have a question. What if the family declines to go to the next step of talking to their primary care provider or considering a genetic counselor? Any kind of tips for that?
Yeah, I mean, that happens. So there's always going to be some families that, you might raise the idea and they're either not ready at that time, or it's just not something they're interested in doing, or I think if they have any doubt or skepticism that they're open to discussing, then that's a great opportunity to connect them to a genetic navigator to understand what value the appointment could hold. I think if you're really getting a total shutdown from a family, we have to respect that also. And you can just kind of say, if you have questions about that in the future, I'm happy to talk about it again, or happy to connect you to resources as you think about it for another time. But I mean, that happens. There's always patients that get referred to genetics that when they get called for an appointment, just say no, thank you. So that's going to happen sometimes. But I think leaving the door open for a future conversation, or offering that connection to a navigator to further understand why they might consider an appointment, are both useful things. Yeah, and then that same thing Dana said, that parent to parent or family to family conversation can really help them understand what their reluctance is, and address any concerns they might have.
Thanks, Alyssa. Yeah, Dana dropped in the number for a genetic navigator to make a referral. And there was a follow-up question, Dana, too. Okay, you're going to have them email you if they need the referral form. And Dana dropped in her email there. And there was a question, do you help families understand the genetic results and next steps?
So when you say, I'm guessing the question is, do you help families? So genetic navigators aren't really in a position to help families understand their test results, but they would be in a position to help families understand who can do that for them. So they, if a family's holding a test result that they don't understand, or don't understand what to do next, they really need an appointment with a medical provider. So a genetic navigator can definitely say, you should, if nobody has explained this to you yet, you should go have an appointment with a geneticist or a genetic counselor to understand your test results and what you can do next. So it's not really, as Lisa said, it's not, genetic navigator isn't a replacement for a genetics appointment, but they can really help families understand when those appointments are really valuable and how to get to them.
And Alyssa, I might add that our genetic navigators are trained in, have lived experience in many different genetic conditions. We have genetic navigators that have children with Fragile X, Charge syndrome, Down syndrome, and even more than that, rare syndrome. Our genetic navigator, Jen, her daughter has a very rare condition. So we certainly don't really understand how to interpret any results. Again, we're not, genetic counselors, but as a navigator, we can help that parent with lived experience and kind of, maybe talk about next steps or what that looks like for their family, or like we talked about, importantly, providing that emotional support, which is so helpful when we get a diagnosis.
Yeah. I'm seeing Tara's comment in the chat about a lot of families getting an autism diagnosis and then everyone stops there and not proceeding to see if there's a genetic explanation for that. I think, we can sort of look for a resource to add to the things that we've shared, but every kid with an autism diagnosis is eligible to go to genetics. So it's not even like you have to figure out which kids with autism should proceed. Everyone should. So we can even find something to make sure that we can share with you guys and share with our genetic navigators. There are written medical recommendations that say that. So I see that, Tara's saying she's written letters to doctors and the letter to the family. Maybe if we can just print out the published medical recommendation and they bring that, that's pretty good support that they deserve and warrant to proceed to genetics.
Thanks, Alyssa. I don't see any other questions, but feel free to keep typing. And Alyssa, if you can go to the
Yep.
next slide.
Yep.
If you all don't mind, if you could complete the post-webinar survey. So you already completed the pre-survey, and Seth, can you drop that link into the chat for us, please? But if you could just take a few moments to go ahead and do that before you leave. And I am going to go ahead and give you some other updates. So if we can go to the next slide. So stay tuned for our next Talks on Tuesday. So normally our Talks on Tuesdays are always the first Tuesday of the month, but because it's election day in November, it's actually going to be on November 14th from 12 to 1 p.m. The topic title is going to be Interconnected Sensory Processing and Social Emotional Development for Infants and Toddlers. So stay tuned for that. Registration will be coming out soon. And on the next slide, you will see that there is a handout that also has more resources. So all the links that were talked about today are on this handout. And so you will, Seth, are they going to get this? That's going to be attached with the survey. Oh, you're going to drop it. Perfect. Okay, so Seth just dropped that into the chat. Also, all of our webinars are archived, and you can access them on veipd.org's site under Talks on Tuesday. So the last part 1 is archived with the handout. So you'll find all of that information there. And on the next slide, you will see that you are going to get another survey, and this is just for this webinar itself. So I want you to go ahead and check your email. And then once you complete that survey, that is when your certificate will automatically populate. Make sure you download that certificate for your records, though, so you'll always have that. And I don't see any other questions, but I just want to thank our panel presenters so much for this information. And it's kind of interesting too, because it seems like a lot of information that people weren't aware about. So this is definitely creating such a strong awareness in our state of Virginia. So we appreciate you taking your time and doing that for us today. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you so much for
Everybody-
this opportunity.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we do encourage you all to check out our NIMAC website as well for lots of resources and information, both for Virginia and for also within our region.
And we will share with Lisa and Corey that resource about autism and genetics that I mentioned before, so that they can put it up with the other handouts and resources.
Thanks, Alyssa. Yeah, so what we'll do is we will add it to the archive on our website once it's
Perfect.
ready.
Very good.
Thank you,
Or-
everyone, again.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.